Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. Tonight we're joined by David Melding MS. First elected to the National Assembly for Wales in 1999 as a representative of South Wales Central, the region he still represents today, he announced earlier this year that he would be not seeking re-election to the Senedd, but today he joins us to talk his life in the Senedd and more. Hello David, thank you for coming on.
My pleasure, Matt.
So we're going to start right at the beginning of your time in politics. What got you interested in politics to begin with?
Well, I was hideously interested in politics from a young age. I think when the Jam announced they were fed up with the Labour government in the late 70s and were thinking about voting Conservative, I don't think they sort of stuck with that for very long. But I mean, it was quite a tempestuous time, the 1970s, a very difficult time for any. And I kind of came of age at that time and got interested, and then I went on to university and like many aspiring politicians, and then the happenstance of being in the right place at the right time and winning an election, which many are called but not that many get to serve. So it's you're quite fortunate really to have the opportunity, because I know so many people in the party of at least equal ability to me that, just didn't get the opportunity. So I do tell people that you need a plan B. I always had a plan B, but I'm very pleased that in the end, my ambition to be a politician did work out.
You're from Neath originally, aren't you? So it's not a traditional hotbed for conservatism, What made you join the Conservatives?
There's always been a solid vote in Neath for the Conservatives, right? But you're right. I mean, obviously, part of the South Wales coalfield, and the prevailing political mood was obviously quite strongly Labour. But there were, Plaid Cymru had presence on the council, and the ratepayers had done very well in the 1970s, and they were kind of lightly disguised Conservatives, I would say. So it wasn't quite as sort of monolithic as sometimes it sounds. But I think your political views get formed fairly early, and mine were pretty much those of conservatism and responsibility, liberty, and I suppose if I had any great heroes, it was still. I was born in 1962, and the Second World War was still very much alive in people's conversations, particularly your relatives, and some of the school teachers that had served in the war and that. And Churchill was this towering figure, and his career fascinated me as well, though he didn't particularly like the Conservative Party. He said, or at least he had an awkward relationship with it. But that's another matter.
So when did you join the party? Did you join before you went to university, or was it a question of getting very involved at university?
Yeah, no, I had joined just before. I went to university in 1981, joined the Young Conservatives, and Neath had a branch, so when we say that it wasn't a particularly rich field for Conservatives normally, you've got to remember in those days, the political parties still had large memberships. So, even in Neath, you had a sizable Conservative association with some Young Conservatives. So I joined that. And then afterward, the real launch was university.
So when you were on the podcast last, you talked about the Senedd chances for Welsh Conservatives last year. But I think you surprised quite a few people when you talked about the referendum in 97 and how you actually were initially in favour of the No campaign. Why was that? Why did you back No to begin with?
Well, I felt that for the United Kingdom to survive as a union, the best option was a unitary state, and with some reform, undoubtedly, but that was the best option. I had written a piece a couple of years before for Welsh Agenda, saying that this is when devolution was very much, in the news in terms of the Labour Party's proposals. And I basically said that if we didn't have a unitary UK, we should move to a federal settlement fairly quickly. So I've always viewed devolution as a bit too experimental, and so for those reasons, I didn't think it was particularly good statecraft. And obviously, it was very variable in different parts of the UK and England. Mostly left out at that stage. Just the prospect of a London Assembly coming back. That's what I found really. If not dangerous, then at least not terribly satisfactory settlement, and it would be too much work in progress. So I opposed and voted no indeed in 97. But the result in Scotland just took us to new territory completely, and it was pointless then even dreaming about somehow turning the clock back. So I had a last hurrah and then moved quickly and thought, well, the people have spoken, and this historical trend has to be respected and worked with.
The Conservative Party in Wales, though, at the beginning of devolution wasn't particularly comfortable with it, was it? And it did have sort of desires to reverse the referendum decision. Why do you think that was? Do you think that was that link to the unitary idea of the state more than anything else?
Oh, I think psychologically it was all wrapped up in, the massive defeat in 97, just before the referendum, and a sense of unease about decentralization, which is often, an ideology in terms of how you structure government or of the centre-right. But in Britain, it's not really been an idea that sat comfortably with Conservatives. So there was that. So the culture was still very much for the ancien regime, if I can put it that way. And then there was a lot of confusion. You're quite right. In the 1999 campaign, whilst the party didn't come out and say it would like to reverse devolution, the mood music, and with Rod Richards as our leader, and Fair Play for All as the manifesto title, if you may recall, and these concepts like linguistic apartheid that we used, it horrified most of us actually who were standing what the leadership were doing. But there were hints, I suppose, that if events moved a certain way, we might revisit the referendum. But of course, they moved in the opposite direction, including Rod Richards moving out of the leadership and the party. So the situation then changed quite dramatically when it was realized that we had to really accept and have a clarity of in our position and accept the result and work with it. So, but it did. It was really the early 2000s before that was transmitted and accepted thoroughly by all the activists, or most of the activists anyway. So it was quite a shaky time.
How important do you think Nick Bournes was to that process of sort of becoming to embrace devolution? And also, do you mind talking a little bit about Ymlaen, the idea to rebrand the Welsh Conservatives and that process and how that went?
Well, I think, leaders are hugely important. It's a job I could never have done and, never had aspirations to do. And I've seen the effort that's required in leadership through Nick Bournes' leadership, which I do think was exceptional. I don't think Nick was, culturally that comfortable with devolution, but he was a realist. I think he was very tactful in a way I would never have been, because, early on, I was writing saying that we have to accept the reality of this, and actually, once we've done that, it would be better to have a robust form of devolution, which was much more balanced across the UK, which eventually became the party's position, but it took many years for that to happen. But I think Nick had those sort of skills of tact and building consensus within the party and determination. But, we didn't move very far until after the 2003 election. I moved a bit earlier with things like Ymlaen, I think, was launched in 2001. I'd have to check my record. But certainly I was writing by 2001 and making speeches about, a fairly, new approach for the Conservative Party in terms of territorial politics. We had to really examine our tradition and ask whether it was still really fit for purpose and craft a new one, basically, and then seek inspiration from Canada, Australia, where centre-right, and Germany, where centre-right parties are usually the side of politics most in favour of federal mechanisms or devolved mechanisms.
In the last few years, I think a lot of people get the feeling that the Conservatives in Wales are starting to become a little bit more hostile towards devolution again, especially on, when you look on social media at the members and stuff like that. Do you think that's the case? Do you think that's the genuine feeling amongst party members that they are a bit more hostile towards devolution now?
I think what has changed from those days is that there's been a fracturing of politics, and we're in a more volatile political age with wider swings in election results, and so parties have a much larger shoulder of support than they once had, which they may get or they may not get an election and their core vote is smaller. So this has clearly happened in the Conservative Party, and Boris Johnson's achievement was and Mrs. Theresa May as well. Mrs. May's achievement in 27 was to get us much closer to the sort of levels Mrs. Thatcher got. But, our vote can now swing anything between the low 30s and the mid 40s, and Labour similar. So this shoulder is there, and some of that is going off to, Green parties, and on the right to, parties like UKIP, and now we've got Abolish the Assembly Party. If that's their precise title, I apologise if I got slightly wrong. So I think to some extent the party has an eye on the danger of losing some support to that side. And so in its desire to be quite a wide, big tent, puts out some messages. But I don't seriously, it thinks that there's going to be a reversal of devolution. But I suppose it's got to sort of talk tough sometimes. So that's basically what I think is happening.
In 2009, you wrote your book, Will Britain Survive Beyond 2020? I mean, we're nearly at the end of 2020, so you're probably right by now. But what made you write the book at the time, and how do you think the union will survive until do you think this union can survive until 2030?
Yeah. Well, I pinched the title or adapted it, the famous Soviet-era publication by a dissident of that time, whose name escapes me embarrassingly at the moment. But anyway, and he wrote this book, published, I think, in 1970, Will the Soviet Union Survive Until 1984? 1984 was, Orwell and that, and people of my age, 1984, before we got to it, sort of loomed a bit, as a year of great portent, potentially, which will mystify younger people, I realise. There we are. We're all embedded in our age. And he only got it wrong by 5 years. And it was a long essay and incredibly prescient. If you read it today, the sort of trends that were picked up or predicted in 1970 proved to be very accurate. So anyway, that was the inspiration. I should say I read politics at university, so this both gave me an interest in political structures like devolution versus federalism, if you're going to have a decentralized state, but also has given me a lifelong interest really in political philosophy. So in 2007, the SNP won a plurality of seats in the Scottish Parliament, only by 1 or 2, as I recall, over Labour, and then formed a minority government and were very skillful at that. So that's basically what gave me the inspiration to deliver. It was a lecture, first of all, that I delivered at the College of William and Mary, where I did my MA in Virginia. So I went out and spoke to, led a seminar actually for the Faculty of Government there. And I took the title, Will Britain Survive Beyond 2020? And then from that expanded it into a book of essays. So, and I should say that the Faculty of Government, obviously, as I'm a graduate, they treated me with great respect, but I think they thought I was crackers to sort of even suggest that, this was a prospect because the SNP had won, or at least with the government. I just thought it was a big moment for Britain, and it sort of marked the end of the days that some people thought devolution would somehow contain and reverse nationalism. I also thought that was very strange analysis of the situation, because what people forget about devolution is that it's not a weak version of federalism. It's an uncontrolled version because it doesn't have a constitutional settlement at its heart, and it doesn't draw clear boundaries. And of course, we were devolving to, some of Europe's most ancient nations. These weren't vague, anemic, regional sort of concepts that had suddenly been invented. I mean, you were talking Scotland, Wales. And I just thought that the sort of political nationhood would be a very vital force, not necessarily leading to desire to secede from the UK, though in Scotland, obviously, that is now the question, but something that needed a more vigorous, energetic response from unions. So I was looking at these things, and I examined also the Irish question, which, people forget the first secession happened 100 years ago and was a very significant one, and one that 10 years earlier you would have thought most unlikely. So, those are some of the ideas I was grappling.
Colin Jones was on recently, and he talked about devolution providing a sort of a sense of nationhood that without devolution just wouldn't be there in modern day Wales, or wouldn't be as prevalent in modern day Wales. And you seem to talk about how this, giving political form to Wales that hadn't necessarily been there in the same way prior to devolution has obviously kick-started so many different things. Do you think it's devolution per se that has created this sense of nationhood and this expanded sense of nationhood, or do you think there's more to it than that?
Well, I think an institutional political dimension to nationhood is, rather than saying it's devolution, because a coherent federalism would have done the same. I think it's the mood of the times, I think, of which this is a really important element, but I don't think it's the whole picture. But it is remarkable how, the progression that devolution took into a much more robust, more or less Scottish system, very quickly, and from a absolutely wafer thin majority in 97 to a very nearly 2/3 endorsement of primary powers in 2011. So, that's where it's remained. The public support was a huge shift, really, from 97, and of course that meant a lot. It was the people that had voted no had suddenly, getting on for half of them, had been reconciled within 10 years. Well, if you voted no in 97 and then, just over 10 years later were keen for more powers, that's quite a big shift.
How do you think the union is preserved then? Do you think it's through something technocratic such as federalism or confederalism? Do you think it's more a question of central government giving the devolved administrations more respect, or at least on the face of it, giving them more respect?
Well, I think I would start with those that avow unionism, being political unionists. And, I do challenge some people and say, well, what have you ever foregone so that you could preserve the union? I mean, what in your political, sort of armory have you said, right, we can't do that because it would damage the union? And I think to be a unionist, you've got to accept there's some things you can't do in the union, or it will be, very much undermined. And I think that's the sense that a lot of Conservatives, and quite senior ones, some of them, have, lost. And that puts us in a different position to, even Major and Thatcher, I would say. And the indifference that is sometimes expressed, and you saw this in Brexit, with some people, more in England, but I mean, I think it wasn't just there saying that, well, if Brexit led to the breakup of the UK, they'd still want Brexit, or England and Wales, or whatever you describe it as. And, I think that's been deeply damaging. It's highly pernicious, that sort of coherent sense of unionism. So I think, unionists have got to come up with something exciting and different as the counteroffer to Scottish independence. And, a technocratic solution, if Devo Max used to be talked about, I've not heard that recently, and all sorts of bells and whistles on the current system, I don't think works. I think you've got to say to people, should we recast the union so that there is some form of foundational law that governs our constitution, that can't be changed easily and not in the ordinary process. So that basically recognises the political sovereignty of Wales and Scotland and England within their domestic arena. And then there's an agreed way of dealing with the big macroeconomic stuff, defence and foreign affairs, which I think would probably be in some reform of Parliament around the upper house becoming the House of the Union. And you celebrate Britishness. And I'll tell you one thing that's going to happen if Scotland does secede, and then goodness knows what sort of arrangements we would have in Wales and what would happen to Northern Ireland then. But at some point, Britishness will come back in terms of how we live together in these islands, and it wouldn't be then as a political union, but it would. I think it has that underlying sense of purpose and response and meaningful. Our cultural exchange, people marry, friends all over the place. I think it's capturing that in a new union that doesn't sort of get ossified and seem really heavy-handed and centrally driven still, with London basically saying, all right, we've got all these powers involved, but we still arbitrate them really. we still control a lot of your space for decision making because England's so big. Those are the things that really need to be tackled. And it's very interesting. Recently, of course, we've seen sort of English decentralization come of age, arguably. And I've been long arguing for this, incidentally, that I've said it will be the cities and the regions that lead England to the path and the road of decentralization. And we're certainly seeing that. It's a bit of an irony that just as England wakes up to, they don't want to be in a very centralized system, because England has been and London is so dominant, that the moment they wake up and say, no, we want reform, is the moment we might lose Scotland if we're not careful, which would be very sad if the English question finally gets answered the day before Scotland departs. So I think there's a lot there for unionists to think about.
I noticed today in your last of the Unionists, you mentioned about English regional identity and the mayors and the opportunity to take this step forward. So talking about the last of the Unionists, what inspired you to start writing your sort of nigh on daily updates on the state of Wales and the state of the Union?
Well, I want to save the Union, or at least I want the Union to be projected in a modern guise, which initially the people of Scotland can then say, well, that's a really coherent alternative. If they, in the face of that, still accept independence, well, they've had a really good free choice between two powerful alternatives and they've made their choice. But for Scotland to opt for independence because they just feel unionism has become tawdry and insipid, or just, lacking the relish it once had, I think that would be very, very sad. So obviously, it's in a way to shock my fellow unionists, but whether it is, I don't know. I do notice on the clicks or whatever you call them, or however you count these things, comments and retweets, it seems to be nationalists at most. Read my perorations, but there we are. They are there. They're there to inspire unionists. So that's why I write it. People shouldn't think I'm a sort of crypto nationalist in terms of wanting independence. That is absolutely not my agenda.
Sure. No, it's I think everyone from across the union nationalism perspective appreciate, and the left and right appreciate the thoughts, definitely. Are you more positive as a consequence of writing these updates, or since you started writing these updates about the fate of the union, or are you more pessimistic?
I'm equally pessimistic as I was the day of the Brexit referendum. I then delivered a speech at St Andrews University in September. There was a conference, basically, with the union after Brexit, and I developed my thoughts. I thought, the fact that very nearly 2/3 of the Scottish people wanted to stay in the EU basically meant they wanted to remain a European nation, which of course was what they were told might not happen if they voted for independence in 2014. So I thought that was a tectonic shift, and one that I know Brexiteers are never really engaged in. They sort of wished away or ignored. Not that I've denied that, the reality of the Brexit vote either, mind. Created a new reality and you have to live with it. But then, and also for the first time since the Irish secession, you had the people of Northern Ireland make a constitutional decision that was in line with the Republic, not with Great Britain or England and Wales. And so I thought that was very significant. And then poor Wales kind of was the odd one out amongst the Celtic nations in the way it had voted. So, all this, I think, has created a very mixed up picture. And I've just tried to give some clarity to the danger the union is in. It can only now be saved by the freshest and most radical approach, which taps our traditions, but, is a new start, basically. And I just don't know if the Conservative Party, if the political elite in England are up to it or will want to do it. I think there's a real issue here. And so that's why the very cheeky title, the Last of the Unionists, not the Last of the Mohicans, but we've all watched the film, but the Last of the Unionists. And I think it's worked as a hashtag. People do talk about it, so there we are.
Oh, absolutely. So you talk about being willing to lose something to save the union, and obviously in that vein, you decided to stand down as Shadow Councillor General for the Welsh Conservatives in order to vote against the Internal Market Bill. What led you to take that decision, and how difficult was that decision to take?
Well, I don't like the internal market bill on its own merits, let alone what it'll do to the union. So for us to take a position that we would break international law on a bilateral treaty that wasn't a year old on a fundamental issue, it was horrifying, frankly. And I just don't know what the likes of Church would have thought of behaving that way. So there's that. But I don't think the bill will survive in its current shape. And the senior members of the government really look at it and what the implications would be if it went through as it is, then I think they will roll back. But it still sends a terribly negative signal, even if that's where we end up. So I've not kind of, in my position on that, thought, well, I'm now going to take a stand for the union, even though politically I quite like the proposition. I don't. I think the internal market bill is, one of the most damaging bills to have been produced on a matter of real substance for many, many years.
This current UK government, do you think they are damaging the union even further with this sort of muscular unionism? Not a sort of, and I want to make a distinction here between muscular unionism that is a sort of a positive unionism, and a muscular unionism that is a sort of bully boy mentality to the other devolved administrations. Do you think they are posing some sort of existential threat to the union, or at least going some way to damage it even further with their actions in these?
Well, I think they're bewildered rather than, malign about it. I don't think they've sat down and thought, how can we stick it to the Scots? And therefore, we're in the slipstream and you end up sticking it to the Welsh. I don't think that's the motivation. And there is a need to clarify what the internal market would be. There is a need to entrench powers of central government. I mean, that's the thing with the federal settlement, is that it divides, doesn't abolish sovereignty at the centre, but it does divide it so that, you share it out. And that's what we've not had. But I don't think that's grasped in London. So they somehow think, all right, we will really lay down the law here so there can be no ambiguity. And then there's basically much more control over many issues, but not necessarily direct legislative control, but the purse strings get used, or something like the UK Prosperity Fund, and so I just think that's why it's heavy-handed. And there's an element, I think, amongst some in London of, what have the Scots got against us? Mrs. Thatcher used to get mystified that, why don't they like me more? I do so much for them, It never works, does it? If you're in that sort of situation of self-regard and self-pity or whatever, something's gone seriously wrong. And I think that's part of the problem. We've not really looked at what the British Constitution needs. It needs a new Act of Union, basically. And it would be much better if the UK government now said, right, we will do this, we will negotiate with the devolved administrations and then, the London Assembly and the metro mayors, and we will bring forward legislation that can, be a sound structure for the future of the UK, should we all wish to remain in it. And instead, I think there's almost a sense of whoever's produced the internal market bill is not being involved in some of the constitutional thinking that's gone on, or even the work around the common frameworks. And they've suddenly thought, ideally, what do you want to govern an internal market? And they've come up with a sort of super version of ultra Brussels control, and the Commission having all these powers that they've just got persuaded the people to take back control and vote for Brexit. And now they kind of want the UK government to have that control over the internal market and have potential overreach into all sorts of things that cannot be devolved. So a very, very messy business and very damaging. And muscular unionism is sort of badging expenditure, is it? If you give money for a bridge or something. I mean, I'm not sure the EU got much out of that type of advertising, but perhaps I'm missing something.
No, it's certainly an interesting way of going about showing respect, I suppose, for a devolved administration by being able to spend in areas they have for 20 years, being able to, within reason, do what they want to. So yeah, it doesn't show that, like we talked about earlier, it doesn't show that respect, which that mutual recognition between partners. So I was just going to go back to your 2009 book, where you did examine the case for Welsh independence, albeit briefly, as is right to do in your very balanced account. Do you think the case is any stronger than it was in 2009? And why do you think more people are supporting Welsh independence than in 2009? Do you think it's looking at Scotland and seeing them move that way, or do you think it's mostly Brexit? Do you think it's the coronavirus situation and how Wales is looked in that?
This sort of indie curiosity is a phenomenon we don't completely understand yet. But I think certainly amongst some younger voters, there's a concept that if at 20 or 30, you're going to be politically interested 40, 50, 60 years, and there's a sense that we may be in a very different place over that time, and who knows what will happen. So I think there's a bit of that in it. I mean, Welsh independence, I think, is a remote prospect, but it is certainly made more likely by Scottish independence, and then whatever happens in Ireland and whatever new structures emerge. So it is not, fantastically implausible. It's difficult because of the economic costs that would have to be borne, even if there was, quite a large sort of transitionary period, and even if you got back into the EU and got help there, and got a good deal on the national debt from the UK government or whatever, yet there would still be one heck of a hole in terms of meeting public spending patterns at the moment. I mean, I don't think it's very likely, but poorer countries than Wales have opted for independence. If the circumstances just accumulate and push you in that direction, it might happen. I mean, obviously, one of the reasons I'm writing The Last of the Unionists is just to remind people, that if we don't survive as a UK state in, more or less the current form, in terms of the membership anyway, with Scotland in, then it's going to be a very strange world for England and Wales, and quite how you protect Welsh autonomy in an England and Wales state is quite challenging. I mean, I'm thinking about this incidentally. I'm aiming to write something possibly in the nearish future, as the next few months, because it's genuinely difficult. So, and I think that also then means, well, some people say, well, let's have independence then, even though, there are fundamental challenges with it. I don't think that, there would be any lack of ability to govern ourselves as a state. I don't think that would be an issue. There are many states smaller than Wales, and there would be the possibility of a different sort of constellation within the former UK anyway. So that may lead to all sorts of new structures. So who knows? It opens the door a bit, I suppose. The Scottish secession would open the door a bit to Welsh independence in the next couple of generations. But I wouldn't bet much money on it, but it is a possibility.
Do you understand the growing calls for English independence? We've seen a few polls in the last few months that have shown that growing quite significantly. Do you think that's just some sort of like Brexit throwback, or do you think that's the weird asymmetry of British devolution, that they've not had a parliament of their own before, and now they just want to have some sort of tangible representative body?
I think it's the old joke was, of course, you don't need to create an English parliament. They've already got one. It's Westminster. And I think that's, been the kind of attitude many have taken. But I think we're in new territory because London Sea and the Southeast has become this sort of supercharged world regional economy, which doesn't fit into the rest of the UK very easily. It fits in much more into the globalized world. And this has definitely created pressures within the English regions, and that's had an effect. As far as English identity is concerned, they've tended to look at Britishness as a sort of Englishness writ large, and that's not going to survive. And Britishness is getting renegotiated, and if we can't come up with fitting that into a new sense of the union, then I do think then the union stays numbered. And I suppose that's the dilemma the English face is, is this regeneration of the union worth the cost? Or shouldn't we just go, because obviously England would have no problem as an independent state. They'd be nearly as significant as Britain was. They would have, in material terms, they would lose legitimacy, and there would be questions about some of our positions, I suppose, or England's position as the successor state to the UK, having a seat on the Security Council of the UN, things like that. So it's certainly plausible. At the moment, we're not at that stage, but it could be the next stage if we're not careful, if people don't value the union. So, that's part of my argument.
So you've told us there's potentially plans for a book, but what else is next for you once you stand down in May? Do you plan to continue with Last of the Unionists? Do you maybe plan to turn that into a book? What sort of things are you thinking about doing?
Well, I'm not sure there's a market for much of this, but what
I think that there definitely
I'll
is.
certainly continue writing.
It's a niche of Welsh.
Yeah,
Welsh politics.
But of course, the wonder. We have so many bad things about social media, but one of the extraordinary things is it makes a dinosaur like me, an irascible old Tory. Suddenly you get a following, and people are seem to be anyway reading it quite regularly. So I'm sure I'll go on writing them. If anyone comes with an offer to publish them as a book, then I'll be open not to lucrative financial offers. I'm sure you wouldn't make a penny from it. But if people did think it was worthy of that, then of being in a book form, then fine. But really what I want to do is really look at what would Wales's constitutional options be, and do that within the sort of wider question of what the union needs to offer Scotland and indeed the other countries. We just talked about English identity and possibility of some form of English political institution as well, or institutions developing. So I think I would like to look at that, because I do think we will face, and I want to do this in time for the second Scottish referendum, which I'm pretty sure will occur sometime in the first half of the 2020s.
David Melding, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on.
You're most welcome, Matthew. Thank you.
If you'd like what you've heard tonight, find us on Meeting at HiraethBlogCymru, on Facebook at HiraethBlogCymru, and on Twitter at HiraethBlog. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review.